Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Black Orchid. Now, Black Orchid is a graphic novel written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Dave McKean and published by DC Comics. Now, this was first published as a 3-issue limited comic book series between the years 1988 and 1989, and then later on, all 3 issues were collected into one graphic novel or trade paperback. Now, Neil Gaiman did not originally create the character of Black Orchid. This character was originally created by Sheldon and Tony DeZuniga, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, and Joe Orlando. But Gaiman sort of reinvented the character for this miniseries. This also features characters from the Batman mythos originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. And this features the character of Lex Luthor, who was originally a villain from the Superman comics, created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And this features the character of Swamp Thing, originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. However, that character was reinvented by Alan Moore in the mid-80s, when Alan Moore took over that series. You can tell that this comic is very much taken off of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. In fact, you could almost call this a spiritual sequel or follow-up to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. They even make direct references to certain events that happened in that series in this comic. You could also look at this as sort of a bridge between Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, which is in the same universe. In fact, you can see a lot of the seeds, no pun intended, of what Gaiman would do with the Sandman series in this. Something I really like about this is even though this features characters from the DC universe, it doesn't really feel like a superhero story. It actually plays out more like a science fiction drama. And even though I call it science fiction, it actually has more of the feel of a fantasy story and almost feels like a modern-day fairy tale or fable, which again is something that Neil Gaiman would do very well with the Sandman. And you really don't have to know anything about the Black Orchid character in order to enjoy this as a self-contained narrative. So, the plot of Neil Gaiman's Black Orchid is it begins where we follow the superhero Black Orchid who is infiltrating this criminal organization. Eventually she's found out and murdered, but we soon learn that she was not a human being, but was actually a humanoid plant creature with the ability to make herself look human, and she had the memories of a human woman named Susan Linden who was murdered. And eventually, 2 new Black Orchids are born, both with Susan Linden's memories, but both their own individual beings as well. One is an adult and the other is a child, and even though these 2 beings are technically the same entity, they both develop sort of a mother-daughter relationship. And eventually in the story, the ex-husband of this woman, Susan, who they both have the memories of, a man named Carl Thorne, he finds out about them, and in order to get back in the good graces of his ex-employer, Lex Luthor, he tells Luthor about them, so now both Carl Thorne and Luthor's men are going after them. So in the story, the new Black Orchids go on this journey to find a new home and kind of discover what their place and purpose in the universe is. And on this journey, they cross paths with the likes of Poison Ivy, Batman, and Swamp Thing. But yeah, Black Orchid was a very good comic, and I like how Neil Gaiman was able to take these already pre-existing characters from older comic books and sort of make them his own and sort of mold them into a story that is relatively self-contained. And you don't necessarily have to be a fan of DC Comics in order to enjoy this, and even though there are some definite comic booky things that happen in this, for the most part, it's a very mature and very adult story. Now, even though this comic is relatively self-contained, like I said, it does work as a good companion piece to Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, because very much like what Alan Moore did with Swamp Thing, Neil Gaiman very much reinvents the Black Orchid character, and also both series deal with a lot of the same themes. There are a lot of environmental themes and environmental concerns brought up in this story. In the story, there's a lot of commentary on man's relationship with the environment and how man's conquest of nature will ultimately be his downfall, and the only way we will survive as a species is if we learn to harmonize with nature. And it's a theme that, even though this comic was written all the way back in the 80s, is still all too relevant, if not even more relevant today. The comic also deals with a lot of themes of abuse, like we find out that this woman, Susan Linden, that Black Orchid has the memories of, she was abused by her father growing up, and eventually she married Carl Thorne, who was also very abusive towards her. And Carl Thorne is an interesting character because even though he is one of the antagonists of the comic, you do find yourself feeling somewhat sorry for him just because of how pathetic he is. And there's an interesting moment at the end where the adult Black Orchid, who again is not Susan Linden, but might as well be because she has all of Susan's memories, does kind of forgive Carl, which I thought was interesting, and it's a really interesting commentary on how complex abusive relationships actually are. Now, I decided to review this comic as part of my yearly series of Batman reviews, even though Batman actually has a very small role in the story, but a lot of the comic does take place in Gotham City, specifically at Arkham Asylum, and Poison Ivy does end up playing a pretty important role in this comic, even though she only makes one actual appearance. Now, I'll admit, Poison Ivy was never one of my favorite Batman villains, but Neil Gaiman really does humanize her more in her one scene in this comic than most comics I've read where she's the main focus. And I like how, in the scenes that take place at Arkham Asylum, you see some of Batman's greatest antagonists, like Two-Face, Mad Hatter, and the Joker, but it never seems like Susan or Black Orchid is really judging any of them. Lastly, I gotta mention Dave McKean's artwork in this. McKean does a great job at sort of skirting that line between realism and surrealism, because his artwork, like the way he draws the characters, is almost photorealistic, but it's also very stylized at the same time. But yeah, the artwork in this is absolutely beautiful. Now, Dave McKean would go on to illustrate one of my favorite Batman graphic novels, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, and in a lot of ways, the scenes in this comic that take place at Arkham Asylum, you kind of see the seeds of what McKean would later do with Grant Morrison on that comic. But yeah, that was my review on Black Orchid by Neil Gaiman, and bye.